Today I'm sharing how I made multiples of a fun fold card in a card design that also works great with a gift card. I'm making Christmas cards, but this design works for any occasion all year. Let's get started. When you're making multiples, it's good to start by knowing how many cards you want to make and what your design is. I'm using the June Sheetload of Cards design from Call Me Crafty Al. Each month, Alicia publishes a clever new sheetload design and provides the sketch and supply list to her YouTube subscribers. This design recipe provides an illustration of the card sketch, the supplies needed, the yield, the dimensions for making one card if you don't want to make the whole sheetload, and even some alternative ideas for changing it up if you want. This recipe is for 6 cards, and I wanted to make 12, so I knew I needed to double all the supplies. The second page shows each piece of paper from the supply list with the measurements for cutting to get the most from the supplies you're using. I started with the easy bits, the 2 card bases cut from white cardstock. I used my big dolly trimmer, which has a cutting guide to help keep my cuts accurate, and I cut both the larger base and the smaller inner base from 110-pound Neenah white cardstock. I set them aside for later. For the decorative panels, I don't have pattern paper and I don't have 12 by 12 cardstock, so I knew right away that I needed to adapt the design to make it work with what I have. I'll make my own backgrounds to fill in as the pattern paper, and my color palette today is Samba, Orange Twist, Skylight, and Hot Tub, which is a fun play on a traditional red and green palette. I drew out some not very accurate cardstock pieces along with the panel sizes from the recipe, trying to be like Alicia and get the most out of each piece. I labeled each piece the same way as on the sheetload instructions and figured out how many pieces of cardstock I would need. To start, I figured I would completely save 3 pieces of cardstock by replacing this 5 1/4 by 4 inch panel with some ink blending directly onto the card base. Now this was a bold move which caused me some trouble. Here's how it started. I looked at the recipe to see where that panel would need to go, and I lined up my rectangle mask stencil over top of the larger card base in the correct position. I used my sticky mat to hold the cardstock in place and to help with making sure everything was straight. I still needed masking tape to hold the stencil in place and also to mask over the rest of the card base where I didn't want any red ink. I used a large Altenew blending brush to put down a mid-tone layer of my red ink. These brushes are super soft and dense, and they get a light layer down smoothly and quickly. I went over it a few times to build up some color. Remember, I didn't have to do the center portion because that smaller inner card is going to be glued there and no one will ever see it. This rectangle in this stencil is 3 3/4 by 5 inches and not 4 inches by 5 1/4, so now I've also adapted the size of the white edges slightly. Then to add some interest, I put a Poinsettia stencil on top of the rectangle mask, and I used a smaller blending brush to blend more red ink through, again just around the edges. Then it was time to remove everything, and this was when it was really important to be careful of smudges. Then I did this 11 more times, and here's what my hands looked like when I was done. The trouble isn't with the stencils or with the juicy red ink, but the fact that I was making so many of them meant that I had red ink everywhere, and it was a real challenge to keep everything clean and smudge-free. After that, I decided just to make panels and keep the card bases safely smudge-free away from where I was working. The second panel was 4 by 4 inches on the recipe, but because of the size of my stenciled panel, I cut it down to 3 3/4 inches so that the white edges will be the same size on this part of the card. I don't have much colored cardstock and none in this color, so I created my own by swiping my Hot Tub ink over the panels. I often make my own colored cardstock in this way, but I have to say, making multiples is the perfect time to actually have real colored cardstock to begin with. You can see that it was getting harder to get the ink to transfer onto the paper as the ink pad dried out, so I stopped for a second to refill it. To do this, I simply press drops of ink into the foam pad, not too hard because I don't want to rip the foam, but firmly to get the ink to soak in. Then I press the ink into the foam with the tip of the nozzle and I'm good to go, and I finished up all my panels. Next, I seem to have forgotten to turn my camera on, but I used this background stamp and my Skylight ink to stamp some Christmas trees onto the panels. For the smallest panel, the 4 by 3 one, I wanted to use strips of all 4 colors plus white. So I started by swiping my ink onto panels of white cardstock. Then I cut them with a sentiment strip cover plate die so that they were all exactly the same width. Then I built my 4 by 3 panels, and yes, I mean 4 by 3. Yes, I needed to cut them down to 3 3/4 by 2 3/4 to maintain that 1/4 inch white border, but I figured it was better to do that after I glued the strips down because it's impossible to get them lined up perfectly along the edges. I put glue on each panel and then I just had some fun mixing up the colors, and honestly, I think I would have preferred to have the stripes going in the opposite direction, but my strips were 4 inches long, so it really made much better sense to use them horizontally. I used some metallic white watercolor to add some frosty splatter to the stripe panels and then also to the forest panels. I also added some white splatter just to the forest panels to give the look of snow. Now while I'm doing all this, Alicia is busy trying out my limes process over on her channel. I'll give you a link at the end of this video so you can hop over to see what she made and also maybe find out a bit more about her sheet loads. Next, I wanted to add some stamping to the inside of that smaller inner card, and I thought I would use the row of trees from this pull-apart stamp, and that would tie it into the aqua panel on the front. I decided against it though, not because the row didn't go completely across the panel, I could have worked with that, but because the trees on each end of it were cut in half, and I didn't think that would look very nice. I decided instead to use the 2 single trees and stamp one in Skylight in the bottom right corner, and then one in Samba just about overlapping it, just to add a little color on the inside portion of the card. For my outer sentiment, I used this fun, scripty Merry Christmas stamp set that has matching dies. I used a panel of die-cut white cardstock as a guide. I lined up the stamp over the negative space, and then I was able to just place each die cut in and stamp it perfectly. Well, as long as the panel didn't move in the Misty. And that's another good piece of advice for multiples. It never hurts to cut a couple of extras just in case you mess 1 or 2 of them up. Because I already had everything set up, I actually cut quite a few extras, and I left the leftovers in the back of my stamp pocket for next time. I love to have leftovers of my favorite sentiments ready for me, and I actually made a whole video about that, which I'll link up here in the corner. Now I'll show you how I assembled one card from start to finish, but for the rest I did it one step at a time. All the scoring, then all the panels, then the sentiments, and so on. I find that more efficient, but it's not that interesting to watch. So first I scored both of the card bases and I folded and burnished them. I added the glue to the back of the inner card base and positioned it in the center of my ink blended faux panel. And you can see why I didn't need to blend right into the center of that. Next, I grabbed one of the straight panels, which was now cut down to the correct size to give me that 1/4 inch white frame, and I glued that to the front of the inner card. Then I glued the square forest panel to the outer card base, and it was easy to line up because I could follow the line of the white frame on the red panel from the back of the card. Now before I did the rest, I actually went back to my Misty and I stamped a small sentiment on the inside of all the inner cards. It says, "You made the nice list." So as you open it, you can put a gift card here next to those stamped trees and then open to see the sentiment. Of course, the gift card is optional. In fact, my daughter actually suggested that I could just change the sentiment to "You made the naughty list" for people who don't get a gift card. I love this card design. It's an easy fun fold with just a little something extra special. Christmas is the perfect time for making multiples, and a sheet load recipe is a great jumping off point for getting them done quickly. You can make the process even easier than I did by using pattern paper or even solid cardstock, but making these 12 cards only took me about 4 hours, and I'm really happy with them. If you want more tips and tricks for making multiples, I have a free checklist over on my blog, so I'll put a link to that below in the description. Now it's time to use this link to jump to the Call Me Crafty Owl channel to see how Alicia made out with my limes process. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.